Live from the beating heart of business, New York, this is Squawk Box.
Good morning. Welcome back to Squawk Box right here on CNBC. We're live at the NASDAQ market set in Times Square. I'm Andrew Sorkin along with Becky Quick and Joe Kernan. Take a look at U.S. equity futures on this Friday morning. You're looking at the Dow looking like it would open up about 47.5 points higher. NASDAQ up about 9 points and the S&P 500 up about 4 points. A couple of headlines to talk about this morning. The Fed's going to be getting yet another measure of inflation to consider this morning. The government will issue April figures for import and export prices. That happens at 8:30 Eastern time. This week has seen weaker than expected increases in both the producer price index and the consumer price index. Also, Barclays CEO Jess Staley has been fined $870,000 by British regulators. This for attempting to identify company whistleblowers. They say his actions fell short of what's expected for the CEO of a regulated company. However, they did not say that Stanley is unfit to continue in that role. Also, shares of cybersecurity company Symantec, they are falling sharply in pre-market trading this morning. That comes after the company disclosed an internal investigation of unspecified financial issues, saying the probe is still in its early stages. But I think what a lot of investors are concerned about is they also suggest there could be a delay in
some of their additional filings,
in terms of their filings,
existing filings,
exactly,
based on some of these issues.
And that's what I think has people anxious this morning.
A little anxious, down 24% for the stock right now. All right, turning to Washington, the Washington Post says that it has obtained documents that reportedly show AT&T paid President Trump's lawyer, Michael Cohen, $600,000 for advice on its merger with Time Warner. Eamon Javers joins us with more on the story right now. Eamon.
Yeah, good morning, Becky. The documents raise new questions about what exactly Michael Cohen was doing on behalf of AT&T. The documents include internal AT&T billing records and an invoice from Michael Cohen to the company. Here's how the Washington Post is reporting it in their story, which posted last night, saying Cohen's $600,000 deal with AT&T specified he would advise on Time Warner merger. Internal company records show. They say 3 days after President Trump was sworn into office, the telecom giant AT&T turned to his personal attorney, Michael Cohen, for help on a wide portfolio of issues pending before the federal government, including the company's proposed merger with Time Warner, according to those documents. Earlier in the week, AT&T put out a memo to employees explaining their side of all this. Here's what AT&T told those employees, saying in early 2017, as President Trump was taking office, we hired several consultants to help us understand how the president and his administration might approach a wide range of policy issues important to the company, including regulatory reform at the FCC, corporate tax reform, and antitrust enforcement. So that's what the company says Michael Cohen was working on for them. Still not entirely clear exactly how long this took place, exactly how much Michael Cohen was paid in total by the company, but we'll wait for further answers on that. Meanwhile, the business of business in Washington continues today with a couple of big events over at the White House. Later this morning, we're going to see automaker CEOs meeting with the president at 11:45 at the White House, and also at 2 in the afternoon, the president's going to speak in the Rose Garden on his proposals to lower drug prices. And our understanding of that is that we're going to see the president roll out a plan which would allow the government in some ways to negotiate more flexibly with drug companies, but not really allow Medicare directly to negotiate with those drug companies. So we'll wait for the details on that as well. Could be big for pharmaceutical companies in the afternoon, guys.
Okay, Eamon, thanks. You know, just listening to see the details, the way sausage is made on K Street, to see the minutia of the way it goes on, only becomes interesting when it's a guy named Michael Cohen, who, in hindsight now, has become a real interesting character.
Yeah, and AT&T pointed that out in their statement. They said, look, the headlines about him didn't surface until about a year later. So at the time of the president's election, they were scrambling to understand this guy, his team as he came in. Remember, very few people in Washington or in New York expected Trump to win, right? There was a surprise upset. So they weren't really prepared for this. So they were scrambling to gather as much information as they could. And we should point out that previous administration officials have done this, right? Democrats and Republicans who were affiliated with campaigns have gone off to do these corporate consulting deals in the past. And there's no rule that prevents that from happening. It's not against any ethical standards or any laws. But we've seen it on both sides of the aisle.
I mean, the revolving door between lobbyists and people that are in government, the way that works, and you know, just you go through the years, and I wonder where lobbying, if you rank it as an industry, I mean, it's got to be above pot or the cannabis. I mean, it's one of the most lucrative businesses.
Well, there are lobbyists who lobby for cannabis, right? I mean, we have that. Look, I think that the key thing to understand here.
Are there lobbyists that lobby for lobbyists? And for lobbying,
yes.
I'll bet you
there's an association of association executives in Washington, D.C.
Right.
Believe it or not.
I mean, we hear about the NRA, but then the teachers. I mean, everybody's paying for yeah. So
right.
It's okay.
Look, here's the key thing to understand. There's a difference between lobbying and consulting, right? Lobbying means specifically having meetings with lawmakers and officials and asking for certain things and trying to push certain agendas in Washington. Consulting means I'm not necessarily contacting Capitol Hill or the White House. I'm just offering advice back to the company. I'm not dealing with the government, I'm dealing with the company.
Yeah.
The consulting industry is entirely unregulated. There's no disclosure forms required for that. Lobbyists have to file all these reports. We can see how much money they make. We can see who they're meeting with. Consultants are the piece of the iceberg below the ocean that we can't see. My guess is that industry is much bigger than the Washington lobbying industry, which is billions of dollars.
I mean, you've been around a while. I remember Billy Carter, Billy Beer. I remember Hugh Rodham.
Yeah.
I mean, if you wanted anything from Bill Clinton, you went through Hugh Rodham. I mean, and he sets up these great companies down in, in Haiti. I mean, anyway, let's bring it. Hence the name Swamp. Anyway, let's bring in. Thank you. And I wasn't referring to Senator. I'm sorry.
Hence the name Swamp. Let's bring in.
Couldn't you at least say present company excluded, Joe?
Right.
Present company excluded. Pennsylvania Senator Pat Toomey. We are pleased and grateful that you're here for an hour and to talk about. And whenever we have you on, I try to get you to go places, and you're always very substantive and serious, and we appreciate that because that's serious business. Because we're trying to help people that live in Pennsylvania. At least that's what you're doing, and live in the country.
Absolutely,
that's the whole point of all this. Why would you do it otherwise?
That's exactly right. And one of the first things I learned when I was elected to Congress is I'm pretty sure there is no human activity that does not have a trade association and a lobbying firm.
That's probably true.
Right.
And you guys, the lobbyists for the lobbyists.
I'm pretty sure I have met the lobbyists for the lobbyists.
And they have lobbyists, lobbying them for the lobbyists. Anyway.
What about cable show anchor lobbying?
We don't have a...
Oh, come on. You don't have an association?
No. White House correspondents that they've gotten such great press.
I probably know some folks who'd like to work with you on that.
Hey, so Senator NAFTA, this is just the one that, just reads, all the newspapers every day. I thought, because North Korea was so important, we wanted the Trump administration wants to do this NAFTA thing, wants to do it quick, and there's going to be a favorable outcome, and Lighthizer was going to make it happen. You're writing editorials that totally leave out the possibility that we exit this thing.
My point in today's Wall Street Journal piece is the administration does not have the unilateral authority to pull out. NAFTA wasn't actually a treaty. It's an agreement, but it was made operative by legislation. 1993, Congress passed the law, the president signed it. That's what put NAFTA into effect. The president doesn't have any more authority to repeal that law than he has the authority to repeal Obamacare or change taxes.
So how did we get to this point where it looks like...
So I'm hoping we don't get there, right? What I'm hoping we get is a negotiation of a better deal. So there are things, and I give a list of items where we could improve on NAFTA. NAFTA was a pre-internet agreement, so we could have intellectual property protection on the digital economy, for instance. The Canadians protect their dairy market, don't allow us in. The Mexican threshold below which they don't apply a tax on American merchandise is extremely low. Yeah. So all of those things could change. I'm not in favor of tightening rules of origin and making domestic content requirements. That's contrary to the spirit of NAFTA and having the free trade agreement. Not in favor of a sunset provision, which introduces the complete uncertainty about how long this is going to last. So what I'm urging is don't negotiate a protectionist agreement and then threaten to pull out from the current agreement and tell Republican pro-trade senators, well, these are your choices, this lesser NAFTA or nothing.
But you're saying pulling out of NAFTA is basically illegal, but that's what we've heard time and time again.
Some are suggesting that they might try to do it anyway. I think they've got a fight on their hands if they try to do that without the consent of Congress.
A fight from...
Congress.
from Congress.
Right.
Is that something you hear from both the House and the Senate, or is there a small group of you who are talking about this?
On the Senate side, it's become increasingly a topic of conversation among Republican senators. I've not discussed this a lot with my House colleagues at this point. Again, I'm hoping it doesn't come to pass. It doesn't have to.
But Paul Ryan is basically saying you've got to come up with something in the next week, or this Congress is not going to vote on it.
Well, there is that as well, right? We've got constraints based on the rules under which we operate on the timing of this. So ideally, we get the outline of a good, constructive agreement that modernizes NAFTA, doesn't move in a protectionist direction, and then I think Republican senators are pro-trade and pro-NAFTA. So the support would be there if it's a good agreement.
Have you spoken with the White House about this?
Yeah.
And their response has been?
They're thinking about it.
You won't get any Democrats, will you?
Very, very few, and that's one of the other points I make. Any time our trade rep raises a protectionist idea, and he has several of those, he'll get an attaboy from the anti-trade protectionist Democrats. But they're not going to vote for Donald Trump's NAFTA 2.0. They're not. I don't see it. Maybe a very, very few. But ultimately, this will rely on Republicans in the House and the Senate to pass this if we're going to do it. And to do that, it ought to be an improvement on the existing deal, not, a backtracking.
When you talk to people in the White House, there's always this sense that there's sort of two White Houses. You could be talking Navarro on one side or Kudlow on the. How do you see that sort of playing out inside?
Yeah, there's a divide, right? At the White House, there are at least two camps on trade, and it's not always obvious which camp has the upper hand, right? I mean, I thought that the steel and aluminum tariffs invoking Section 232, which is national security, as the reason we had to impose taxes on the 20% of our consumed steel that we import, mostly from Canada, right? Is a terrible idea. But it was announced. But if you think about it the way I think about it, the bark was worse than the bite, right? If you look at it, actually, a lot of countries were excluded. We're in a process now. It's taking too long, but hopefully Commerce is going to exclude products. I think that reflects that yin and yang going on inside the White House on trade.
I was thinking what you just said. There's a lot of enemy of my enemy going on there, and just in terms of they're not going to support anything that Trump does. And I was thinking about the reason. Let's talk Iran for a second. The reason that President Obama didn't go to Congress was because there was bipartisan opposition to the bill. Bipartisan.
Correct.
Republicans and Democrats both didn't want to do the Iran treaty. Okay, so now Trump's trying to get out of it, and now there's bipartisan, or at least on one side of the aisle, they love, even Schumer suddenly loves the deal and wants to stay in, because you can't possibly, if you agree with Trump, you can't go to your constituents and say, I'm a Democrat with a straight face.
It's become a real problem, right? Because this is just playing out time and again in all different ways, right?
Gina Haspel.
Gina Haspel is a great example, right?
I mean,
John
Brennan,
they're all for Brennan,
right?
Who was much more senior at the CIA at the time of the enhanced interrogations, who almost certainly played some role in approving
the actual decision to approve it.
To do this, and that's okay. But Gina Haspel, who was too junior at the time to have had that decision-making power, has said she will absolutely comply with the law, which now forbids those kind of techniques, and she has no interest in changing the law, and yet they can't support her. It's ridiculous.
But just on the point with the Iran nuclear deal, we had Ehud Barak on, the former Prime Minister of Israel, earlier this morning. He said he hated the deal when it came through, but now doesn't want to see America pull out of it because European allies aren't going to pull out of it, so the deal will still exist, and that's his concern.
Yeah, so what is that, right? That raises the question. So what's the effect, really, of the U.S. pulling out when the European countries are indicating they intend to stay in? I think the effect of this is we're going to be putting much more economic pressure on Iran than we would be if President Trump had not made this decision. And I think that's a good thing. There's a lot of very, very bad behavior happening. The Iranian regime is still very dangerous, a serious threat to the region, to the United States. They are on a campaign for hegemony in the Middle East, and I think we should be pushing back.
Is that because of the other activities that they're doing outside of nuclear, or is that because you think they are still continuing with nuclear and all of those other terrorist activities?
So it's both, in the sense that with respect to the nuclear deal, first of all, it's the things that should have been in the deal and are not, like the ability to test their ICBMs and to develop missile technology. That should have been covered. It was not. That continues. There's the fact that we don't really know very much, right? What we learned from Benjamin Netanyahu, without a shred of doubt, is they were systematically lying about their program, right? They always denied. We knew that, but now there's proof. We know that they saved the documents that were sort of the basis for their plan for nuclear weapons. We know that there are military facilities that we have not inspected and cannot inspect. How do we know what's going on in those places? And then there's, of course, all the malign activity that they're engaged in throughout the region.
All right, Senator, thanks for being here. Stick around. We're going to talk a lot more after we, I don't think there's no lobbyists involved in our commercials, but we do need to take, there's money. Money makes the world go round. I'm sorry. It's just, you know, it's just a fact.
We're going to talk a little bit more about money with the senator in just a little bit. Coming up, the Dow notching a 6-day winning streak this morning. Futures indicated Dow will be up about 38 points, S&P 500 up about 3, NASDAQ up about 8. We will talk markets and what's turning out to be a rally right after the break. And the nation's automakers heading to the White House today. There's a live shot there for a meeting with President Trump. We'll have a preview of what will be discussed. Stay tuned. You're watching Squawk. We are back in 60 seconds.
It's a wild ride.
Welcome back to Squawk Box. This morning, I want to talk markets. Joining us right now is Charles Campbell, Managing Director at MKM Partners. Good morning to you.
Morning.
Nice to see you. We've been calling it a rally. It's like a rally that sort of...
Well, in May.
I don't think we even realized the rally was here, and now it... No, I mean, you're looking at me like I didn't, but no, but it sort of crept up on us.
Did on Thursday.
Is that a fair way? Is that a fair way to describe it?
6 straight days. 6 straight days.
It has crept up on us. I mean, if you look at the stock 600, I saw this morning, it's up 7 weeks in a row, longest such streak in over 3 years. You know, our equivalent to the S&P 500. We have a couple of things going on. We have corporate results that are generally better than expected. Right. And you might say, well, why isn't the market up 15%? And the reason is, first quarter of 2019, earnings are expected to gain only about 6 to 7%. So a lot of this is going to be from a higher base as a result of the Trump tax plan. We have some economic data from the United States. We had a CPI report yesterday, generally weaker than expected in terms of a core number. If you take out the energy, food, and that housing component, on a month-over-month basis, CPI was actually down. That has dovish implications for the Powell Fed. They can hang lower for longer. In their statement last week...
That's what's driving it? I mean, how much of this do you think is an interest rate move or lack of an interest rate move in terms of the move that the market's making?
It's a combination of things. I mean, the interest rate move, the absolute level, is going to be less important for 2018 than the path that rates follow. That is to say, after we had the non-farm payroll report with that hot hourly earnings that was subsequently revised down early February for, what was it, December?
Yep.
The market was so emotional, rates spiked. That's difficult for equity investors to hold on to. But one that is more moderated and more gradual can be a constructive one for equity investments.
We were talking about this last hour. Front page of the Wall Street Journal, buyback surge, steadying market.
Yep.
And I say, you know, we were saying steadying. Some people say artificially inflating.
There's nothing artificial about it. Part of the Trump tax plan, you've got increased corporate revenue. Revenues are exceeding expectations. 90% of the companies have reported in the S&P 500. Right. They're exceeding expectations on the top line by about 75%, above the 4-quarter average. The bottom line as well by about 78%. We knew part of the Trump tax plan, where they reduced the corporate rate, that was a salient feature of the entire plan, was you're going to get increased buyback activity, you're going to get increased strategic M&A.
You know, Larry Summers has been talking about the market's been artificially inflating since November 8th. And there is a statute of limitations eventually on that call.
The reason I'm
there's a 40% artificial. I know, but
the buybacks, whether it's masking an economy that may not be as strong as the market would otherwise indicate.
You could have said, following the financial crisis and the Fed moving its balance sheet from $930 billion to $4.5 trillion, that the market was artificially inflated, and you'd be from 660 up to 2,700.
Right. And so many times we said there's a multiple. There's a multiple. It's not the economy. It's the multiple you assign to the earnings into the economy.
I'm giving my time to the senator.
Thanks. My understanding is that the growth in buybacks and dividend increases has been swamped by the increases in CapEx, at least among the big S&P companies. Is that your understanding of the data, and doesn't that suggest that we could have more sustained growth at elevated levels?
Technology is about 25% of the S&P 500. In Europe, it's maybe, as a sector, it's about 5%. One of the things we learned from the 2000 tech boom and bust is that technology companies are cyclical in nature, and therefore they have a CapEx component. Google, in their earnings release, talked about the CapEx component, and investors were dismayed by it. I'd be heartened by it, because what it tells you is it's a bullish commentary about demand.
Right. And the surge in CapEx is bigger than the surge in dividend increases and buybacks, according to UBS's data anyway, which I think is extremely bullish.
When corporate guys, I mean, they do like to buy back stock, but they do look at everything else they could be doing with the money. And if they realize that, that's the...
And there's nothing wrong with buying back stock.
It's not artificial.
In fact, you've got an obligation to your shareholders to return the money.
And that's
you
where
can't get a better return than
money
the
flows downhill to where it's treated best. So it's not an artificial... If it happens, it happens.
I'm not making the argument that all buybacks are terrible. I'm just suggesting that one of the issues is there's a incentive, there's a personal motivation if you're an executive.
I know.
To buy back your own stock, because guess what? You own the stock. So you have to think about that rather than take.
It's just like when I be. Okay, we gotta go.
We're coming back to this a
we'll
little
talk
bit.
Mother's Day.
Time now for today's Aflac trivia question. What instruments did Leo Fender play? The answer when CNBC's Squawk Box continues.
Friday, I'm in love. How do they do it? Good morning and welcome back to Squawk Box here on CNBC, live from the NASDAQ market site in Times Square. Among the stories front and center, Wynn Resorts continues to be at odds. That's pretty good too, right?
Betting odds?
Yeah, with its largest shareholder, Elaine Wynn, the casino operator, sent a letter to shareholders saying that Elaine Wynn's campaign to remove long-standing board members is undercutting the company's effort to institute change. Wynn has maintained that those longtime directors should be removed as the company tries to change its culture. The letter maintains that Wynn herself is actually part of the old guard.
By the way, she's not only the largest shareholder, she owns about 10% of the company, a little over 10% of the company. So you're not talking about a 1 or 2 or 3% owner in this situation.
By the way, she sat down with Jim Stewart. I don't know if you saw the column this morning in the New York Times in Vegas, and goes through a whole litany of things wrong with the company and why she's doing what she's doing.
And it didn't stay in Vegas.
It did not stay in Vegas. So it's worth a read because it gets right to the issue of what this whole fight is about.
And to just wrap this up, Wynn's former CEO, Steve Wynn, shares something in common with CEOs who received top pay in 2017. Many of them are gone, are off the job. A Wall Street study shows that of last year's 20 highest paid CEOs of S&P 500 companies, 8 are no longer in the role. That does include CSX CEO Hunter Harrison, who passed away, while the others departed amid boardroom conflicts, deteriorating financial performance, or other issues. Martin, one of those guys? Sorrell?
WPP?
I don't know. We said probably not. That's not, or is it one of the?
He was definitely one of the top paid.
Yeah, he was. Yeah. And shares of Dropbox, not Lockbox, are lower in pre-market trading. The decline comes despite a beat on the top and bottom lines. In Dropbox's first quarterly report, as you know, it recently had an IPO. As a public company, the stock has jumped about 10% this week ahead of that report.
President Trump's decision to exit the Iran deal sent shockwaves through the international community. Joining us right now to break out the fallout is Barbara Slavin. She is director of the Future of Iran Initiative at the Atlantic Council. Of course, our guest host this morning is Senator Pat Toomey. Barbara, thank you for joining us today.
You're welcome. Pleased to be with you.
Why don't you just give us your assessment, what this means with the United States pulling out of this deal? Where does that leave us in terms of our European allies? Where does this leave us in terms of what happens next?
Well, there are a lot of disastrous potential consequences. I think one of the worst is that this is really putting new strains on the transatlantic alliance. If you look at the European newspapers this morning, there's a lot of talk about repercussions in terms of trade wars, how Europe should stand strong against the United States. You may recall that Britain, France, and Germany made a very earnest effort to try to keep the Trump administration in the deal by offering new sanctions, new concessions, and it wasn't enough. And President Trump did what I think he always intended to do, after basically toying with our European allies.
Well, that's what I was going to bring up. But look, this is something he campaigned on. He said he was going to do it from the start. If anything, it's taken him a while to get to this point of doing this. I'm not sure why it comes as a huge shock. This is a deal that had very mixed reviews in America, in the public, and also with Congress. This was not something that Congress ever voted on. So I can't say it comes as a huge surprise.
Well, you know, the funny thing is that the deal had gotten more popular over time, and a majority of Americans, when polled, favored it, and even many Republicans on Capitol Hill said it was better to have this than to have nothing. We're now in a situation where, once again, the President of the United States has blown up an agreement without anything to replace it. So Iran could be unconstrained in terms of rebuilding its nuclear program. Of course, the economic implications are dire. We're already seeing the price of oil go up, the price of gasoline go up. And I think there are going to be major trade disputes now between the United States and Europe, and not just over aluminum and steel.
Senator Toomey.
Barbara, Pat Toomey here. It doesn't strike me that economic consequences for the U.S. are going to be disastrous by any means. Not even clear that this has long-term implications for the price of oil if Iranian oil finds its way into the markets, which it might well do. And if it doesn't, probably a modest increase. My concern, the concern of many of my colleagues, is the really dangerous behavior of Iran before, during, and since the Iran nuclear deal. We now have proof positive that they were, in fact, pursuing nuclear weapons. There are sites in Iran that we have no access to. They got a huge sum of money up front. Why not put some economic pressure on them?
I'm going to stop you there.
Why not put some pressure on their economy?
You know, I'm going to stop you there. We are going to lose the access that we've had under this nuclear deal, which has been extraordinary.
I don't believe the IAEA has been to a military site since the agreement.
They have been to military sites. There has never been a request that they've made that has been refused. And what Bibi Netanyahu presented was very old news to those of us who followed this issue for a long time. I beg to differ. I think the inspection will go down, not up. We're going to have more uncertainty. And as we've already seen, it's contributing to conflicts in the region. This recent dust-up between Israel and Iran in Syria, this is something that's going to, I'm afraid, get more frequent. So I don't see how pulling out of this deal is going to change Iran's regional posture. I think, if anything, it may make them more aggressive.
I think the hope is that we'll put some economic pressure on them, which would raise the price for the regime of this bad behavior, this extremely bad behavior.
With all due respect,
there's been domestic unrest in Iran for the first time on a scale since 2009, and their currency is weakened dramatically.
So you think
Inflation
the
is high,
regime's going to fall
unemployment is
because of this?
I don't know what's going to happen, but we're on a very bad path.
Yes, we are, and President Trump has just made it a lot rockier.
I don't think so.
Senator, go ahead.
Yeah, I disagree. I'm sorry.
No, my point is we have to step up dramatically, I think, the pressure on this regime. And we don't have any good choice. It was a very bad idea to release $100 billion to them on the promise that they would behave well. They have not behaved well. In fact, they've behaved worse. And the deal allows them to have a very short window for a breakout.
Barbara, let me ask you on those points.
I disagree.
There are people who have been very concerned with this all along, particularly about what happens in 10 years, what goes back to that point. Also, a lot of the things that were not included in this deal, the funding of terrorism around and beyond this. I don't think anybody thought that this was a fantastic deal. Even the Obama administration said the reason they were doing this deal, which was not a great deal, was because they were worried the Europeans would do it without them, and they would be left behind.
Yeah, I don't think that was the issue. Look, the point is we bought ourselves a lot of time, and now we've thrown that time away. We bought ourselves an insurance policy, and now President Trump has shredded that insurance policy. Iran is going to continue to do all the things that we don't like. In fact, this is going to strengthen more hardline elements in that country. It's going to strengthen the military in that country. And for what? I mean, you know, the point is that President Trump was actually winning because of the uncertainty he had put on this deal. Not that many European and other companies were going back into Iran. They weren't seeing huge benefits from it. But now he's thrown away the leverage that the United States had to get anything more. The Europeans are not going to come back and talk to us about more measures. The Europeans are furious. And this is just yet another unnecessary crisis created by a very reckless president.
So what do you think happens next?
I think the Europeans are going to see what they can patch together, how they can protect their investments and their trade with Iran. They're going to threaten to take the United States to the WTO. They may threaten tariffs, reciprocal tariffs. It's going to make all of our trade negotiations with them much, much harder. And, you know, it's a time, I mean, at some point, the United States will need the goodwill of the rest of the world, and we've now squandered that.
I know Korea is not what you're here to talk about, but I'm just dying to hear your take on North Korea and you know, whether you're going to call that reckless and somehow put a negative spin on what's happening in North Korea. Is that a landmine or a disaster waiting to happen as well, in your view?
You know, I sincerely hope that we're able to reach some sort of deal with North Korea. North Korea, unlike Iran, has nuclear weapons, 20 to 60 of them. Iran has no nuclear weapons, or at least it didn't up until now. I hope that these talks go well, but, you know, I have very little confidence, I have to say, and I think the North Koreans, after seeing what has happened to this Iran nuclear deal, which, may I remind you, was blessed by the UN Security Council, unanimous support for this agreement. When North Korea looks at what happened to the Iran nuclear deal, they're going to demand a lot of benefits up front and perhaps a very, very slow process of denuclearization to make sure that they can put their economy back on track before they really have to give up their nuclear weapons.
You know, I think this underscores, if you're a fan of this deal, which I am not, I never have been, you can see what a bad decision it was for President Obama to ignore the bipartisan will of Congress. This wasn't an agreement between the United States and Iran. It was between President Obama. He knew that this should be a treaty brought to the Senate, chose not to do that because he knew it didn't have the support, and now, you know, he has to live with the consequences. I actually think this is a constructive development because the behavior of Iran, we were supposed to just accept that status quo and continue to allow the aggression throughout that region, who knows what kind of cooperation with North Korea.
Who invaded Iraq? Who allowed Iran
Actually, Iranians
to expand
did
its
that
influence?
also.
Who invaded Iraq? The United States overthrew a regime and gave Iran space to expand.
And who is supporting Hezbollah and arming them, and who is importing all kinds of aggressive offensive technology to threaten Israel, and who is carrying on a proxy war against the Saudis. The Iranians are on a track. Their hope is to have hegemony in the region, and that is not a good outcome for the United States. And they'd hope to do it with nuclear weapons because they have preserved the infrastructure for that. This agreement allowed them to keep centrifuges. They've been attempting to buy equipment that is supposed to be precluded by this agreement.
That's not true.
Yes, it is.
Look, we will have this conversation in a few months or years, and we will see how well this decision worked out. I can assure you that it's not going to improve Iran's behavior, as you call it. It is a very, very reckless and ill-considered move.
Barbara, thank you for your time today.
You're quite welcome.
Okay, coming up when we return, the president's going to be meeting with automakers today at the White House. Tariff talks and tax reform going to be dominating that conversation. And then at the top of our 8 o'clock hour, the Secretary of Health and Human Services is going to join us to discuss the president's plan on drug pricing. That conversation and a lot more when Squawk returns.
Auto company CEOs are expected at the White House this morning. Joining us now is Paul Ingrassia, editor at the Revs Institute and a longtime automotive journalist. There's a lot of interesting dynamics going on that you point out, Paul. So we're going to talk all about these CAFE standards. It's just interesting the quandary that the automakers are in, and you point out, why are we doing this? We're exporting oil at this point. So the automakers should probably embrace the relaxation, but they can't do it because that means California is going to put in its own standards, and they're worried about that. So it's bizarre, the pickle that they're in.
Well, exactly. The automakers really need consistency, and honestly, they would prefer to see the CAFE standards rolled back in their heart of hearts, although they don't want it to be portrayed that way because they're sensitive to how they're perceived on environmental issues. But, you know, a larger issue, honestly, as you just said, is I think the case really needs to be made at the public level by someone why we need CAFE right now. I mean, honestly, we are exporting oil these days, not importing oil anymore. And electric vehicles don't reduce CO2 emissions, really. What they do is just change the emissions to the source of the power plant, unless, of course, it's hydroelectric power or wind power. But there's not a whole lot of that.
In London,
no, most aren't.
And then you got the diesel, you know, the Green Lobby loves diesel, and London's like L.A. now, basically, with all the diesel cars, and that doesn't help.
Well, yeah, I mean, no, absolutely. I mean, diesels, the European governments really pulled one over on their consumers and their people, honestly, by subsidizing sales of diesels in the interest of, you know, they get better gas mileage, and therefore you're going to get less pollution and more conservation. And what they forgot about was, you know, there's NOx as opposed to CO2. CO2, the carbon dioxide, is global. NOx is local. And there's tons of it in all these European cities right now. The air quality is horrible.
Paul, can you speak, though, to the issue? Because I think there has been, even in the United States, and maybe everyone's been sold a bill of goods, when it comes to electric vehicles, when we talk about the Teslas of the world and everybody else who's building electric vehicles, this idea of lowering CO2 in the atmosphere. That was part of the promise that Elon Musk and so many others made, and you're suggesting that that's a false promise.
Well, you know, it's not entirely a false promise. It's just oversold. You know, electricity's got to be generated somewhere, and unless it's generated by wind power or hydropower or steam power, in other words, if it is generated by fossil fuels, that still produces CO2 emissions. Now, let's grant this. It might be less harmful to people if all that is done out in the desert, but the CO2 issue is a global issue. So it still goes up into the atmosphere from the point of the power generation.
But you feel good. You feel a little better.
Yeah, you feel a little better,
and
right?
And you can virtue signal. You can drive around your neighborhood and wave, and you know, you can have your carbon offset bumper sticker and everything.
My understanding was always, though, that there was an efficiency argument, which is to say, actually, that taking wind and everything else aside, that you're not driving big gasoline trucks around that's actually transporting the gasoline. You're not. I mean, that actually it is less. I mean, at least that's my understanding. Am I wrong about that?
Well, no. I mean, fuel efficiency is an issue for CAFE, but again, the question is, and I think that someone needs to step forward and make the case for it in the modern day. Why do we need fuel efficiency when we're exporting oil? Other than we just feel good about fuel efficiency.
Well, exactly. And look, there's people who value that, and so they'll buy vehicles that have better miles. And the folks who would rather have a big pickup truck, they're going to have to pay more because, you know, they got to put that much more gas in it. The late Obama-era rule that will just about triple the civil penalties on vehicle sales that are not compliant, I think that's just outrageous punishment on people who are just exercising their choice in what kind of vehicle to drive. And I think Congress ought to take a look at whether we can still undo that, and I think there is a chance.
Well, you know, the politically honest but politically unpalatable way to deal with this, if you really want to conserve petroleum, and again, we are exporting petroleum right now, but if you want to do that, use the time-honored economics and raise the gas tax. And, you know, people will respond to incentive. They'll consume less fuel. They'll switch to smaller cars. But that's politically unpalatable. It just won't happen.
Paul, you got a long career. You were a journalist for a long time, weren't you?
Yeah, I still am, actually.
Well, yes. That's what I mean. But now he's able to speak. He's able to. God, you've left your mainstream media shackles behind. And I got Toomey. I got you. I'm just wow. Happy Friday. Thank you. Anyway, Paul Ingrassia. Your brother, though, I don't. We still got to work on him, I think.
No, we don't. Larry's one of the greats.
Got to work on your brother, Paul. We got the good Ingrassia today. Thank you.
Yeah, he's a great brother. Let me put it that way.
Okay. Coming up when we return, we're going to wrap up our special hour with Senator Pat Toomey. We got a lot to talk to him about, and then later in the show, Apple's march to $1 trillion after the stock touched new highs and hitting market cap of over $930 billion. What will drive the stock to $1 trillion and beyond? And do they get there before somebody else? We're going to find out. Squawk returns in a moment. Welcome back to Squawk Box. We only got a couple of minutes here. final hang with Senator Pat Toomey. Good to see you again. Before you go, we got a couple things. We're going to talk about the midterms, what you think is going to happen. And by the way, before we even go, I got to ask you about the Michael Cohen stuff, just because we've been talking about AT&T all morning. We've been talking about lobbyists. What do you make of it?
Yeah, I don't know what to make of it yet, honestly. I mean, it's a little, well, not more, a little. It's very surprising to me that any big company would be paying a lot of money to a guy that it's not obvious that he adds a lot of value to the discussion about their merger, for instance. So were they expecting to get some kind of entree, or what were they expecting? I don't know. We'll find out.
And how often does that happen, though, in your world? Did you ever have friends who then hung out a shingle after you got into a position of power? Or do you ever hear from people who say, I'm trying to figure out a way to get to Pat Toomey? How do I do that?
You know, you have former staff members who work for lobbying firms, and they certainly, you know people on the Hill, and so that is part of the appeal. That's why they get hired.
Right.
So that's not exactly the same thing, but that's close.
Okay, what's going to happen in the midterms? On the Senate side.
Yeah.
Talking about the House side.
So there's actually mixed data on this. Everybody focuses on the special elections in which Democrats have outperformed. All across the country, that's a fact. But some interesting little anecdotes. The generic ballot has tightened up. In Ohio, there was a surge in Republican turnout. Everybody thinks that the Democrats are all energized and not Republicans. And we've just got a lot of seats where you have vulnerable incumbent Democrats in states where Donald Trump is still extremely popular.
Such as in Indiana, where the president was.
Indiana, West Virginia, North Dakota, Montana, Missouri. And then we've got places where we've got great candidates running in Florida. You know, that's a real problem for the Democrats to have Rick Scott in this race. So I think we've got lots of opportunities on the map. Pennsylvania could become competitive. The Ohio race could become competitive. And in terms of vulnerable seats, Dean Heller in Nevada is going to have a tough race. But he's doing a great job. He's doing everything right. He's a solid candidate. He's been a good senator. The open seat in Arizona could be competitive, probably will be competitive.
Do you want to comment, by the way, on what sounded like a terrible comment out of the White House yesterday related to McCain?
I'm not aware of it.
Did you not? It was in the news everywhere.
What's the comment?
That there was a comment.
It was an unnamed White House person
that a White House staffer was
that said he'll be
making fun of the senator, saying that he's dying.
No, they're saying that his vote. Yeah, they're saying that his vote won't matter at some point. It was a snickery, snide, horrific comment that was verbalized. That that. I mean, that's such a. What do you mean all over the news?
It was all over. It was all over.
It's just the crazy stuff you come up with to ask this senator. Anyway,
it's great to see you.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Thank you for
coming.
Fun.
Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks.
When we